Iridion 3D. It was a launch title for the Game Boy Advance, and it feels ahead of its time in some regards, and way behind the times in others. Now the story is... well, some people blew some stuff up, and suddenly you're in a spaceship shooting a bunch of guys, but your one spaceship is the aggressor attacking all these helpless people. Which makes sense considering that you're up against a horde of mindless enemies. They're the self-defense force that you're attacking, just trying to defend its people. You're the invading asshole who's just trying to wreck stuff. Of course, I might have that backwards, but the game doesn't exactly specify, so I choose to say I'm right. Now, what's interesting about this game is it's a third-person rail shooter. It feels a little bit in the vein of the old Galaxy Force games. A little bit. And the first thing that struck me was how cool the environment of the first world looks. Like, yes, it's a bland tunnel, sure. But if you look at the tunnel itself, it has this neat pseudo polygonal look to it. Some of the bosses also have this effect, and it looks great. However, the game also has this weird contrast with the actual sprites. Both the enemies, bullets, obstacles, they all have a very basic sprite style that focuses mainly on scaling. And because it doesn't take this sort of pseudo 3D look, they really just stand out and look a lot lower quality. In all honesty, looking at the 3D effect, I didn't know the Game Boy Advance could even pull something like this off. I was very impressed by this. But the contrast between basic sprite and these polygonal models end up just making it look really, really wonky. But you know what? I'm honestly not that offended about how a game looks. The problem that this game has with its pseudo 3D effect is that it actually makes it incredibly hard to play. First off, because your perspective is directly behind your ship takes up a certain amount of visual real estate. This means that if enemies are directly in front of you, you're not going to see them, you're going to run into them and likely die. That makes things really awkward. It also doesn't help that, unlike a lot of rail shooters, you don't have any sort of targeting reticle. Now this seems like a very small thing, but this means that attacking enemies is awkward because you don't really know where your shots are going. Combined with the greatest flaw of all that this 3D effect provides, because this game does not produce a fully rendered 3D environment, but instead slaps 2D sprites onto a 3D environment, it does not create a sense of depth perception. You really can't tell where your ship is in relation to the world around it. Various enemy ships, obstacles, bullets, you have no idea how close or how far they are comparatively. Now after a while you do get a little bit used to this, but even then it feels a bit wonky. And even if you do get used to it, I noticed that the hitbox for the ship seems to actually be slightly bigger than your sprite. I'll let that sink in a bit. That's kind of the exact opposite of any other shmup ever, is at worst, your sprite is your hitbox. Generally, and if you really want to confuse the hell out of me, your hitbox is a small bit of your sprite, generally found in the center. However, this game, it seems to extend a few pixels all around it, which in turn, when combined with the inability to really judge distance between yourself and your opponents, makes dodging things very difficult. But that's not even the full extent of this problem, because it's compounded even further by the fact that your weapons don't seem to be all that effective. The game seems to be focusing less on attacking your opponents and more on trying to avoid them as much as possible. And I'm sure you can figure out that this is a bit of a problem when you don't know where you should be in order to dodge attacks. That's kind of a colossal problem. Now I think it's important to talk about the weapons when it comes to gameplay. They're all kinda awful. Now there's about 5 or so different colored power-ups for your gun. You've got your standard shot, you've got a green one, a purple one, a gold one. I think there's one more after that, although I honestly can't remember. And if you pick up the same color over and over, you'll upgrade it. Aside from getting an extra shot with each upgrade, all the weapons feel the same, and they don't feel effective. At several points during the game, you'll run into like a mid-boss to each level that takes several shots to blow up. or sometimes act as a puzzle of sorts. You know, you shoot one part that's a different color than the rest to beat it. Very basic, but still a cool effect. And near as I can tell, the game won't advance until you defeat these mini-bosses. So you're kind of forced to go into combat, despite the fact that the game doesn't seem to want you to be in combat. So the gameplay is just kind of not fun. Now, I don't think you could talk about this game without talking about the soundtrack. Because next to the visuals, the soundtrack is probably the most impressive thing about this game. All of it fits very well, it's all very fast-paced, very exciting, and it all fits perfectly. The sound effects are more or less throwaway though, but I think that the music makes up for it. At least a little bit, because the music is terrific. And I think in the end, this game is an example of style over substance. It was trying to push the Game Boy Advance to its limits with a fantastic soundtrack and amazing environments. However, it felt like the developers didn't realize that they had to back up their presentation with gameplay, because the gameplay is more or less a complete write-off. Simply because you're focusing entirely on dodging, and that's very difficult to do when you don't know where you are in relativity to anything else. And then it'll throw you into boss fights or mid-boss fights where you need to kill stuff. And sure, you can take a bullet or two, and you've got a few lives in case you die, but your weapons are weak, pickups are few and far between, and they all feel the same, with the difference being the shot pattern a little bit, and even then, it's barely noticeable. Do I recommend Iridion 3D? Not really, no. I mean, it's a neat little curio, which honestly cost me like 50 cents, but it's honestly not that fun to play. However, it should be noted that this game did apparently sell well enough to not only get a sequel, which I'm trying to get my hands on because I've seen some video footage of it, and it looks infinitely better because it takes a almost sort of three-quarter isometric top-down view, and that actually looks like it works way better. But it also ended up evolving into a launch title for the DS called Nanostray, another game I'm also trying to get my hands on. And I also believe that the series has had several games produced more recently. I think I heard of one on the Wii U. So I can only assume that the series did well enough to continue to this point, and I can only hope that they've learned to back up their presentation with their gameplay. In the end, unless you think this looks really, really, really cool, and you just have to play it, I'd skip it. But if nothing else, it shouldn't cost you more than a few pennies.